we do here is go back.
I'd like to give some counterpoints, criticisms, and clarifications regarding my discussion with Owen, better known as OGMizen. But before I do, let me just say, if you see the logic of my arguments, you don't see errors in the arguments themselves, yet still feel unsatisfied, you are not alone. Moral skepticism is extremely unsatisfying in that you are left to give meaning to your life in other ways. This armchair psychological declaration might be why people look at skepticism and just move on. This is not a diagnosis of Owen, this is my own experience. I've oscillated between skepticism and objective morality a few times. At one point, Owen characterized skepticism by saying skepticism is the perfunctory retort, "I don't believe you," when someone says they have some given moral premise or belief. This isn't true. The purpose of arguments is not to win debates, but help other people refine their understanding of the world, and we argue with reason and evidence. We place a burden of proof upon the person who tells us to refine our beliefs. This standard acts as a safeguard against unfounded beliefs that might frustrate our interests. Moral skepticism applies this standard to moral claims. In a nutshell, moral skepticism says that no amount of evidence proves moral truths. Moral beliefs justified by moral premises are circular or regress infinitely, and therefore moral arguments are invalid. Since valid moral arguments can neither be made by reason nor evidence, we as skeptics do not refine our worldview. Owen says that there is a third way to justify moral beliefs, however. Direct perception of moral facts reveals certain moral claims as self-evident, he says, and thus prevent the infinite regress of having to justify one belief with another. Before I jump into Owen's stance, I'd like to revisit skepticism, since my first video did not do a good job of explaining what the skeptical position is. On the claim that no amount of evidence proves moral truths, this is the explicit portion of the is-ought gap. While it might not seem clear why facts cannot justify moral conclusions, it's true by definition. Regular facts themselves are considered non-moral. In deductive arguments, premises do not explicitly contain the conclusion, but rather the conclusion is the necessary inference we must draw if we accept the other premises as true. This necessary inference is what makes the deductive argument so powerful. In every conceivable world, deductive arguments are true. Unfortunately, any set of facts about the world can be true whether or not a moral premise is true. For example, given all of the true things we know about the world, it could be the case that murder is immoral, but it could also be the case that murder is morally neutral, because morality, for whatever reason, does not exist. This is a tacit claim that one cannot rule out the possibility that nothing at all is morally wrong. This belief is called moral nihilism. Intuitively, this may seem incorrect, but there is nothing logically inconsistent about this premise. If a moral conclusion or its negation can both be true based on the same facts, then the two sides of the argument are not connected by a necessary inference. Therefore, if you use only facts to argue and your argument is valid, your conclusions can't be moral. If you only use facts to argue and your conclusion is moral, then your argument is invalid. Regarding the claim that moral beliefs cannot justify moral conclusions, this is the indirect implication of the is-ought gap. Since we can't justify moral beliefs with non-moral premises, all that's left are moral premises. This leads a skeptic to ask how the moral premise is justified. The answer can't be that we use other non-moral premises, since the invalidity of such a move is what got us here in the first place. The other two options are that an infinite chain of arguments is necessary to justify a moral belief, or that we reason in a circle, where we assume the truth of the conclusion from the start. An infinitely long argument can't be made by finite beings, so this is typically considered an invalid argument. A circular argument simply assumes what we were saying had a burden of proof in the first place. This essentially removes the burden of proof arbitrarily. Now, when it comes to Owen's claim that some moral beliefs are moral facts, which are self-evident to anyone who perceives them, we can ask what self-evident really means. It could mean that along with the moral premise itself, there is a reflexive premise saying that a moral fact is a kind of belief that doesn't require justification. It would then be reasonable to ask why it doesn't require justification. One answer to this Owen might give is that we intuited the premise in much the same way we use our senses to perceive the external world. Our skeptical response might be that the senses are often wrong. Owen could likewise come back that despite our senses being wrong sometimes, we still rely on them to form beliefs about the world. To this I would respond in two ways. First, since our senses are not premises in deductive arguments, they are therefore inductive methods of justifying our beliefs. Unless our intuitive senses cannot be fooled or mistaken, it too is an inductive proof, or some evidence of a given moral statement. At this point, Hume's problem of induction is relevant, but I won't go into that in this video. I'll include a link below which describes that argument. Second, we have no particular reason to believe that our intuition is actually a sense at all. Sure, other animals exhibit pro-social behavior, but we are assuming that our feeling of disgust or approval is some internal artifact of those external behaviors. This assumption isn't justified, because our subjective experience and that of animals could be entirely different. By entirely different, I mean it's perfectly possible to explain animal behavior as the result of unconscious processes in its entirety. That doesn't require that this is the actual case. It only relies on the idea that this is logically possible, or that this is physically possible. This is known as the philosophical zombie argument in the philosophy of mind. There are good reasons why we should reject this argument for humans. We can draw out from Wittgenstein's refutation of solipsism that philosophical zombies are impossible for humans. This is a long argument. I've never seen anyone else make it, but I will definitely do this in the future. At one point, Owen said that there is a truth of the matter as to whether certain kinds of experiences contribute or diminish well-being, and we could assume that these premises are determined by intuition. Let's say some true things about well-being then. Whatever its definition, it would have to include health. Then you have to say that we directly perceive health as moral. Okay, that sounds vague enough to be true. Then you have to say, what is health? Whatever the components of health are, it's unlikely that you would say that these are intuitively good in isolation from one another. A response might be that health is intuitively good, not as a result of its component properties each being intuitively good in isolation, but as the result of these components combining and being good cumulatively. This too would be a moral statement in need of intuitive justification. That justification would contain yet another moral premise in need of yet another intuitive justification. You see where I'm going with this? The circle starts right back up. You're going right into the infinite regress again. At one point, Owen said that there is a truth of the matter as to whether certain kinds of experiences contribute or diminish well-being, and we could assume that these premises are determined by intuition. Let's say some true things about well-being then. Whatever its definition, it would have to include health. Then you have to say that we directly perceive health as moral. Okay, that sounds vague enough to be true. Then you have to say, what is health? Whatever the components of health are, it's unlikely that you would say that these are intuitively good in isolation from one another. A response might be that health is intuitively good, not as a result of its component properties each being intuitively good in isolation, but as the result of these components combining and being good cumulatively. This too would be a moral statement in need of intuitive justification. That justification would contain yet another moral premise in need of yet another intuitive justification. You see where I'm going with this? The circle starts right back up. You're going right into the infinite regress again. That's not even delving into the current lack of measure of well-being. It's precisely because well-being is difficult to define that those who appeal to common sense notions about suffering are never faced with the task of justifying each of well-being's components as intuitively and indisputably correct. All of this is premised on the idea that we want a deductive argument for morality. If inductive reasoning is valid for our acceptance of the external world, however, what's to say such reasoning isn't sufficient for morality? First, you have Hume's problem of induction. This could be the subject of another 20-minute video, so I will leave that aside. Second, if intuitions conflict, by what metric do we compare the empirical evidence gained by embracing either set of intuitions? Surely, any measuring stick you would use would contain some moral premise about what is a good outcome, thus begging the question. You don't have to beg the question when talking about how we might go about measuring health. Health has a use and therefore has a meaning. It's unclear how useful the phrases well-being or human flourishing are. At first glance, they may seem to refer to something specific, but so does the phrase free will, even though there is no sensible account of what this could refer to. You might believe in causal determinism. You might believe in quantum indeterminacy, but neither gets you free will. For an expanded argument on why you shouldn't believe in free will, please see Sam Harris's book, Free Will. It's really good. There are three cases for the existence of animal consciousness that I want to address. The first is the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. The second is the academic paper, Insects Have the Capacity for Subjective Experience. And the third is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on animal consciousness. These things all have one particular thing in common. They basically ignore the hard problem of consciousness. I laid out the hard problem of consciousness in my debate with OGMizen, and I will link to the argument as originally presented by David Chalmers. Owen essentially responded that we can make reasonable inferences about animals with similar brains. But this actually doesn't solve the problem that we have no meaningful thing to analogize to. That is, because we have no scientific materialistic account, no real account of what consciousness actually is, no sensible theory even, analogies are essentially useless. When it comes to health, precise components and their significance may be disagreed about. When it comes to consciousness, we don't even know where to begin looking for components. At one point, Owen also said that unless we can say with certainty that we will get an end result, we can't say a certain action is moral. What level of certainty is required? Cartesian certainty? Does it have to be as certain as, I think, therefore I am? Are consent and the social and verbal cues of voluntary behavior sure to the Cartesian extent? I am very certain that there are ways of raising and killing chickens which give them lives worth living, undiminished by the qualifier barely. That is, they have lives worth living, full stop. Luckily, if our end is lives barely worth living, there's a ton of wiggle room. If only 10% of the chicken's lives are affected negatively by human intervention, we just need enough of them to make up for that chicken well-being deficit. On Owen's remark that the killing of chickens causes grieving in other chickens, if we accept the kind of moral calculus that runs throughout the repugnant conclusion, the grieving time that adds percentages of unpleasantness to the chicken's lives can all be factored in by adding more chicken. There's another argument which directly contradicts veganism as justified by utilitarianism. In its original form, it's called the utility monster. I'm going to lay out that argument in a stepwise fashion, numbering each of the premises. And this will be my final argument. 1. Well-being and suffering are two ends of the same spectrum. 2. The more intelligent the species, the more well-being it is capable of experiencing. 3. Human beings are the most intelligent species on Earth. 4. Since suffering and well-being exist on the same spectrum, comparing them is an apples-to-apples comparison. 5. Meat provides either culinary or nutritional value to those humans who consume it. 6. The killing of animals for meat causes suffering in those animals. 7. It is logically possible that the well-being derived from humans eating meat outweighs any suffering from negative health effects or environmental impact associated with eating meat. 8. It is logically possible that humans derive more well-being from eating meat than is negated by animals who suffer it. 9. This is an intermediate conclusion. From 1 through 8, we can conclude that it is logically possible that eating meat is a net positive of well-being and therefore good. 10. Painlessly slaughtering animals who have lived lengthy, stress-free lives yields a net positive of well-being when considering the benefits of consuming meat, compared with the suffering of animals. 11. There are framing practices which not only farm animals for meat in the way premise 10 describes, but which also are environmentally friendly. 12. Eating a balanced diet which includes meat can be one which yields a life expectancy and quality of life comparable to veganism. 13. From 10 through 12, we can conclude that eating animals which were raised and slaughtered responsibly, in moderation, can be good for humans. 14. The above argument applies to utilitarianism. 15. The above argument is inconsistent with veganism. 16. Therefore, either veganism is invalid or utilitarianism is invalid. 17. If utilitarianism is invalid, it cannot be used to justify veganism. Okay, so that's the end. I've included the full transcript of the video in this description, as well as links to all of the papers and philosophical arguments I've mentioned. If you liked the video, a thumbs up always helps. Comments always help. Sharing this video with people who are interested in veganism or philosophy always helps.